I'm originally from Atlanta, Georgia, and grew up in more of a city setting to rural Maine is a big change for me. A few years ago, I got my gun permit and a hunting license, and I regularly join my brothers-in-law for seasonal hunting trips. They're both big on turkey and deer. I could go without either, but my spouse grew up on venison, so I always bring some back for her after a hunt. Plus, it's nice to not have to buy a grocery store turkey around Thanksgiving. So late last September, we were gearing up for a turkey hunt and planning on camping overnight for 2 days to scope out a valley area. My brother-in-law Teddy was familiar with this area and got permission from the landowner to hunt there. We took my other brother-in-law Josh's truck to a logging road to park and hike in. I personally love the hiking side of hunting and always get behind just looking at the scenery. Maine is a gorgeous state, especially as far north as we are. It can be desolate and wild, but overall, it's beautiful. We hiked into the camp about 6 miles and were situated on the rim of the little valley, which didn't drop too far down but created a bowl shape. We were in a nice spot near a lookout where, early the next morning, we'd be able to see down into the valley and watch for any turkey movements. Once we were settled in, it was a little after noon and we weren't planning on much other than checking our gear, having a few beers, starting dinner, and winding down. The plan was to get up a little after 3 a.m., so sleep is pretty important on these trips. Teddy was sleeping in a hammock, but Josh and I both had pup tents. We got those set up our camp chairs, and were just hanging out. After about 2 hours, the 3 of us took off into the woods to get enough firewood for the 2 nights we'd be staying. Teddy and I stayed closer together, but Josh wandered a little further, wanting to keep an eye out for turkey trails. I had a solid armful of logs and was walking back maybe 200 feet behind Teddy when I saw him freeze. I've never seen a grown man stiffen up like that, even in serious situations, and I'm a linesman by trade, so I've seen some stuff. Teddy went completely still, all 6'1" of him, and I paused, not sure what he'd found. Of course, you hear horror stories of hunters finding decomposing bodies, and that was my first thought. Stepping carefully to be quiet, I think in reaction to the fact that he hadn't shouted or anything and wasn't moving, I came up behind him. He heard me and turned, his eyes wide. I immediately knew to be quiet too, and looked to where he'd been staring. In front of us was a huge sleeping creature. At first I thought we'd stumbled on a grizzly bear, but there aren't actually grizzly bears in Maine, so I knew that couldn't be right. But this thing was huge. Easily twice the size of the average black bear we have around here. It was curled up the way dogs curl up to sleep and had its face tucked into the rest of the body. It couldn't be a black bear though, because the hair was a copper red-brown and really dense, almost matted. Black bears can get a dark brown or cinnamon color, but I'd never seen a bear this color before and had the same reaction as Teddy as reality set in. This just couldn't be a bear. I ran through a short list of other possibilities in my mind, but Teddy was already backtracking quietly. He put his logs and kindling down at some point, and I followed, also trying to be quiet. A few minutes away from our camp, both of us out of breath from adrenaline, we heard a gunshot. It was incredibly loud and we both jumped, then ran toward camp, knowing it could only be Josh. When we arrived, he was huddled near his tent and pointing a handgun at the ground. "What did you just shoot?" I asked him, starting to panic in case a bear or moose was going to come at us. Handguns aren't usually enough to stop them, but he said he'd shot up into the sky, at an angle. Teddy took the gun from him, and with my ears still ringing, I looked around. The campsite was completely ransacked. Josh's tent was bent sideways and mine was upside down, a few feet from where I'd pitched it. Teddy's hammock had been pulled down out of the tree and the rope was ripped clean through and frayed. The campfire was scattered and our things were everywhere. "Just get the guns and ammo," Teddy said, and we scrambled to the shotguns. I also grabbed my hiking bag, which was pretty emptied out. The 3 of us took off on the trail back to the logging road right away. We only had a few hours of daylight. Once we'd caught our breath and were steadily working back toward the truck, I asked Josh what he'd been shooting for. He explained that when he'd gotten back to the camp, there was something in it. A bear, he thought at first, and he could see it thrashing our stuff around, but then he got a good look and realized it had an ape-like face. Concave, without a snout, and with human-like ears. It completely freaked him out, so he shot once into the air and the thing took off with a kind of hooting or whooping sound. I was going to mention the thing Teddy and I had found sleeping, but Teddy got to it first. We both admitted to not seeing the thing's face, but we were both sure it hadn't been a bear. We spent the last hour of the hike in silence, each trying to figure out what we'd seen. We never told our wives and just said that it wasn't an ideal time or place for a turkey hunt, blowing off their questions. It only comes up when the three of us get together and have a drink, usually, but we still don't know what we saw. Josh puts the creature he saw at well over 7 feet tall. He and his brother are both over 6 feet, and insists it had an ape-human face. The only thing I've come up with is that we must have been in Bigfoot territory. Teddy thinks that's ridiculous, but he's never had a better answer. The three of us still go out hunting, but not on overnight trips anymore, and we keep a wider array of guns on us. Usually we go in groups of 5 to 8 too, just in case. Since I'm not as attached to hunting as my brothers-in-law are, I've been thinking about giving it up. I have no idea if the things we saw in the woods were aggressive, but I don't like what they did to our camp in the minutes we were gone. I grew up in New England, and as you're probably aware, there are plenty of legends up there. Most of them I never took seriously, like Sleepy Hollow or stories about old people hibernating through winter in the snow. There was a state park I lived near and used to frequent a lot, as did other kids my age. It was where we went to hang out. I was 15 when this happened, and would go out with friends and just sit in their cars and gossip or play dumb games, that kind of thing. Nothing too serious, but we'd stay out pretty late. This was back before cell phones were common, so we had no way to get in touch with our parents if anything happened. Luckily, nothing ever really did. One night in August, right before school started, my friend Sherry and I took her car out to the state park and pulled up into one of the parking areas to a spot near a pond. The park has a river running through it that's associated with the devil, but again, I'd never taken this seriously since it was just a story I grew up with. Sherry and I spent maybe 20 minutes talking about the prom coming up. It was autumn and cold for New England. The car's windows fogged up a bit from how warm we were, and we were very focused on our conversation. I had my seat, the passenger seat, kicked back so I could look at the car's roof. Sherry was sitting up a little more than I was because she'd grabbed some fast food on the way here and was eating. There was a lull in the conversation, and out of the corner of my eye I saw her freeze. I looked over and she was holding the fountain drink up but not moving. "Are you okay?" I asked her, thinking maybe she was sick from the food. We didn't eat out a lot and junk food could get dicey. Sherry looked scared and shushed me but didn't explain. My body locked up as I realized something was wrong. It took everything in me not to sit straight up and see what she was looking at. After a minute, she relaxed and told me, "I think someone's dog got loose and is walking around outside." We had a dog growing up that had wandered off a few times, so I always felt bad about these situations and suggested we should get the dog and bring it home. But Sherry shook her head and told me no. It didn't look like it had a collar on, she told me, and it was big. I waited for a second before asking her more questions about the dog because she seemed really freaked out. That was weird to me because Sherry wasn't afraid of dogs normally. But being out in the park at night could be freaky, and it was a little windy, so maybe she was just nervous. Now that I was sitting up, I could look outside. I had to rub the fog off the windows but didn't really see much except for empty picnic tables and a dark area where the river was. Maybe a few 100 feet from our car, a covered bridge crossed the river. Crossing it took you to trails in the woods. Sherry had calmed down a little bit and we were talking about life again when I caught movement near the bridge and turned my head. I saw the dog and at first was ready to open the car door and call to it. But I stopped when I realized something was off. The dog was really big, like bigger than a German shepherd, and it was black, almost impossible to see in the dark. The moon wasn't full, but it was bright enough that we could see the dog's silhouette as it moved around near the picnic tables. Sherry locked the car's doors as it came closer, but the sound of the locks drew its attention, and it turned its head toward the car. Sherry turned the car on, and the headlights hit the dog. It was huge, easily able to look into the windows if it came any closer, and it had a big, blocky head, kind of like a pit bull but with a longer snout. I could see that Sherry was right and it wasn't wearing a collar. She put the car in reverse, but I told her to wait a second. The dog wasn't moving closer, and I wanted to get a better look at it since it looked so strange. I realized as it was looking at us that its eyes were different. Most animals' eyes will catch light at night, but the dog's eyes were red, like actual red, which I'd never seen before. The whole body was completely black, and it had a long, thin tail. Sherry said she didn't want to wait and reversed the car. She hit the speed bumps hard heading out of the park, and I kept checking the side mirror to see if the dog was following us. It didn't, but after that, I was never really comfortable at the park at night. I'd go during the day for parties or picnics, or sometimes with my family, but I always looked for the dog. I haven't been back in over a decade now. Sherry and I lost touch after high school, but that night I felt very close to her. I've had my suspicions for a while about a dogman or a werewolf here in Somerset County, Maine, but it wasn't until recently that I actually saw it. I live on a farm on a few acres of land, and my only neighbors are to the northeast about a mile down the road. It's pretty desolate out here, and there's not much to do except hike, hunt, and fish. This particular day, I decided to go fishing out at the riverbank. I was only out there for like an hour, when all of a sudden I heard a howling. Now, in the modern day, there aren't many wolves in Maine, but it's not exactly unheard of. They are few and far between, and the ones that do pass through here are usually traveling from Canada. Coyotes are usually the ones howling out here, but they have a more high-pitched sound than whatever this thing was. The howl was low and guttural and carried on for like a full minute. Now, I'm sure I was the only one who heard it because I was really out in the middle of nowhere. It sounded pretty close and like I'm not an expert on these things, but I figured it was better for me to be on the move than to come face to face with it. So I started to pack up my equipment and be on my way back to the house. As I was walking, I kept hearing it, and it was really getting loud now. I thought to myself that maybe it was a loose dog and followed me to get some food, but even the largest of the beagles and bloodhounds don't howl that loudly. There's just no way. I started picking up the pace, and when I got into the house, I slammed the door behind me. My walls are pretty thin, but I didn't really hear any more howling after that, so I figured I'd just clean my fish and start on dinner. I was laughing to myself and flying some oil as the sun started to set. I had my meal and then sat down with my book and my lazy boy. I was starting to doze off in all honesty when I suddenly heard a growling sound from outside. I put my book down and looked over at the window. The lights were on the porch, and I could see clear as day this beast staring back at me through the screen door from the steps. The only thing between me and this creature was a thin sheet of mesh as I left the door open to allow the breeze to come in. I was terrified and tried to stay as still as possible. At this point, it was on all four legs and just looked like a massive wolf. I could see its dark gray-black hair standing up in spiky tufts on its back, and its head was dipped low. I shifted my weight in my seat, and the thing started to stand up. The porch only has 2 steps, and as it crept up them, it moved itself onto 2 legs. The thing was over 8 feet tall, and its head was a huge mass of fur with a long snout. My eyes were glued on its row of huge, snarling teeth, and I held my breath as it continued to move closer and closer. The creature looked into each of my 2 porch windows, first the left and then the right, before centering itself back at the front door. It just sat there, like a Doberman waiting for supper, and sniffed a deep breath right at the mesh door. As it pulled its nose away, a drop of drool was left on the wire. I couldn't believe my eyes. If it wanted to, it certainly could have scratched and broken right through the door. Even if the door was closed, those powerful claws could have certainly done some damage on the wood frame. It just sat there, though. It just looked at me and sat there. Damn, I do think I was lucky, because who knows what would have happened if I tried to run or fight it. I think my freeze instinct certainly kicked in, and I just waited it out. Eventually, a white-tailed deer started across the lawn. I could see about 20 feet away, and I definitely spotted it before the wolf thing. But as it walked by, the wolf lifted its snout into the air and took a whiff of the air. In an instant, it raised up onto its two hind legs and jumped into the air. I heard a squeal from the deer and the sound of gnashing and gnawing. I quickly grabbed a poker from the fireplace and armed myself. When I looked back outside, however, the creature and the deer were gone, leaving just a puddle of blood on the lawn. I definitely couldn't sleep that night, and for the next few days, I stayed over at my brother's house. I'm really terrified to go back to my farm. That thing is definitely out there, and I worry that next time I won't be so lucky. I certainly would have ended up like that dew. I hope I never see that thing again, but if I ever go missing, I just want the world to know that it was this wolf creature out here. I worked at a coffee shop for a while, and it was a chill job. You got to meet all kinds of people, and most of them were excited to get their coffee. It was a 9-to-5 type of job, and I had all sorts of jobs with crazy hours, so the normalcy was refreshing. Every single day for the past year, our first customer of the day was this man named Larry. He was always in a rush and always got a black coffee. Occasionally I could get some pleasantries out of him, but most of the time, he just stared bloody daggers at me until I got him his coffee. It got to the point where we would open about 5 minutes early and have his coffee ready for him so we could hand it through the window. He would often grab the coffee, pay, and leave without saying a word. He was a very strange individual, but he always made me laugh. He wasn't the biggest fan of human interaction, but he sure did love his coffee. He always had a very serious and wide-eyed expression on his face, and I never saw him smile. Then one day he just stopped showing up. I would still open the shop up about 5 minutes early out of habit, but he stopped coming altogether. I began to wonder what happened to him. Did he move? Did he start getting his coffee somewhere else? Did I somehow offend him? After about a week, I started looking into it a little bit. All I knew was his first name, Larry, but I was determined to figure out what happened. He wasn't the biggest talker, but I knew if I could just talk to him, he would let me know why he stopped coming. I searched Larry and filtered for our city on Google, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, etc. I couldn't find anything at all. I eventually just figured he had moved, and I tried not to think about it. About a month went by, and I saw Larry's black car coming through the drive-thru again. It was much later in the day than I usually saw him, and he had a smile on his face, something I never thought I'd see. I was excited to see him, even though we'd barely even spoken before. I asked him if he wanted his usual, and he asked what his usual was. I kind of laughed because the man ordered the same thing at the same time for an entire year. I told him that he always got a large dark roast coffee, and he said he'd like a green tea. I sort of joked with him that he was switching it up a little, and he laughed and laughed. His laugh seriously disturbed me. My joke wasn't that funny, and he had tears streaming down his face in a deep, bellowing laughter. He kept laughing harder and harder, and he stared directly into my eyes the whole time. I nervously laughed along, but something wasn't right. This wasn't the Larry I knew, and at this point, his laughter and his face had me fearing for my safety. I politely waved him on and closed the window, but he stayed by the window leaning toward me. He was laughing so hard that he was spitting all over the window. His eyes looked different. I couldn't see the white in his eyes at all anymore, and I wondered if he was having a stroke or something. I picked up the phone to call the police when he just sped off. It was seriously disturbing. My coworkers all asked what the hell was wrong with Larry, but when I told them what happened, they just kind of laughed it off. But I was freaked out. I finished my shift and headed to the grocery store to get something to cook for dinner. When I got out of the store, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a black car. I really didn't want to believe it was Larry's car, so I just got in my car and headed home. Sure enough, the black car pulled up right behind me and started following me. I looked in the rearview mirror, and it was Larry with his black eyes and a huge, creepy smile. I was seriously freaked out, and I just sort of pretended not to see him and kept driving down the road. Every turn I took, he closely followed. I eventually just started driving randomly and erratically to see if he kept following me. Without hesitation, he closely followed every turn I made. I eventually called the police and told them that a regular customer of mine was now stalking me, and he seemed incredibly dangerous. They asked me what my car looked like and told me to drive straight to the police station. I did as they asked, and as soon as I pulled into the station, Larry took off down the road. I thanked the officers, and they told me I couldn't get a restraining order against him unless I had some undeniable evidence that he was stalking me. I felt helpless but figured that the worst was over, and I headed home. Waiting in the parking lot of my apartment building was Larry in his black car with a terrifying smile on his face. His mouth was huge, and his eyes were pitch black. I drove by and went to sleep at my parents' house that night. The next morning at work, I was freaking out that he might be there to get his coffee or green tea, but I didn't see him. I was incredibly relieved, and I went on as if nothing had happened. When I got to my apartment, there were hundreds of completely full coffee cups from the shop that surrounded my bed. It was as if he'd saved every single cup he'd bought from me and not had a single sip from any of them. I had my parents help me move out of there immediately, and I quit my job at the coffee shop. The only thing I can figure is that Larry was possessed by a demon, based on his facial expression, behavior, and eyes. I haven't had any experiences with him since, but I'm living in constant fear that I might see him again. When I was a teenager, I worked at a restaurant that was in an old farmhouse. The bartender, the busboy, and the owners had all told me that the house was haunted, and even some of the longtime diners had stories about encounters with the ghost that supposedly lived there. The odd thing was that the ghost didn't seem to want to scare anyone. It tried to be helpful. A missing kitchen tool would suddenly appear on the counter in plain sight. A misplaced set of keys would show up under the diner's table after 3 different people had looked in that spot. A kid would suddenly be holding a toy that no one recognized. There were tons of stories like that, and everyone thought of the helpful ghost like a mascot for the restaurant. One day, when I had gone into work early to do some deep cleaning, I broke the cardinal rule: never go into the basement fridge without letting someone know you were headed that way. The interior lever on the door was tricky, and if the door slammed shut behind you, you were stuck until someone released the door from the other side. Additionally, the basement had very limited cell service. So there I was, completely alone in the place, which was not out of the ordinary. I often went in during off hours for deep cleaning and prep work. I realized that we were out of lemons in the kitchen, so headed downstairs to grab some. My boss never needed to know I had gone downstairs without a buddy. Big mistake. When I opened the door to the fridge, I sent the block that we used to prop the door open skidding across the floor. Without thinking, I went after it and heard the door slam behind me. I immediately knew that I was in trouble. Not only was it super cold in there, but my boss was also going to be super upset with me. She reminded us constantly that we needed to go to the fridge in pairs. I checked my cell phone. No surprise, but I had no signal. I then got to thinking about how it would be several hours before anyone else showed up, and even longer before someone realized I was missing or headed downstairs for supplies. I thought through my options, which were 0. I just had to wait it out, freezing in my t-shirt and shorts. My teeth started chattering. It was really cold. I started pacing to keep myself warm, occasionally holding my phone over my head to check for a signal. I only needed 1 bar, but none ever appeared. On what seemed like my 200th lap of the fridge, I had my back to the door when I heard the distinctive thunk of the door handle being pushed from the outside. I whirled around, expecting to see my angry boss or a confused coworker, but there was no one. But the door was swinging open. I dashed out of the fridge into the hallway that led to the stairs. I looked around and called out but didn't see or hear anyone. I then ran up the stairs. There was no one in the kitchen, in the dining room, or at the bar. When I peeked out the window, mine was the only car in the lot. And then it hit me. Our ghost. It's all I could figure at that point. But the only answer I could come up with was that our helpful ghost had let me out of that fridge, sparing me hours in the cold, and also from the horrifying possibility of having to pee in a corner. I never told anyone about my experience because I didn't want to get into trouble. but I never laughed at anyone again who said that they had encountered the ghost, and that was the last time I went into the basement alone.